filled with stories, some of which are quite strange. Let's take a closer look into the weird tales of nature. Life as a caterpillar can be rather difficult. After all, caterpillars are rather lacking in a number of departments. They don't move particularly fast, and they aren't known for their intelligence. Even their senses are rather dull, as their simple eyes cannot form proper images. They can only detect general levels of light and darkness. Of course, in some species, caterpillars are equipped with a surprising array of defensive measures. All sorts of camouflage, mimicry, deception, poison, and venom, depending upon the precise species. While these are interesting in their own right, today I would like to talk about something a little more subtle. Sometimes, caterpillars enlist the aid of other creatures. In the small realm inhabited by the insects and their neighbors, it is difficult to envision a more successful group than the ants. These colonial predators are found on nearly every continent, apart from Antarctica, and they are significant in every ecosystem they're found in. They are so abundant and so commonplace that people tend to overlook them. Their populous numbers, combined with their tenacity and ferocity, make them ideal creatures to enlist. In fact, there are a great many species of plant, insect, and arachnid that work with ants in various ways. This is such a common occurrence that the phenomenon has its own name, Myrmecophily, literally a love of ants. So a myrmecophilous insect is essentially an ant lover. As one might easily have guessed by this point, a great many caterpillars are myrmecophilous, particularly in one family. This family is known as the Lycaenidae, and it is one of the largest families of butterflies in the world. This is not to say that the butterflies themselves are large, if anything, quite the opposite. These charming little butterflies are commonly known as blues, coppers, hairstreaks, or harvesters, depending upon the species. The family as a whole is sometimes called gossamer butterflies, or gossamer-winged butterflies. While these creatures are pleasant enough as adults, it is in their larval stages that they become truly interesting. The majority of Lycaenid caterpillars have some degree of association with ants at some point in their development. These associations range from mutually beneficial arrangements to rather horrific forms of exploitation. To begin with, though, how does a caterpillar convince a colony of ants to work with it in the first place? This would seem to be a daunting prospect, as most people can attest to the aggressiveness of ants. Surely a tiny, soft-bodied caterpillar would seem to be an ideal morsel to butcher and carry home for the ant larvae to dine upon. Indeed, this happens quite frequently with other types of caterpillar. Not so the myrmecophilous Lycaenids. Formidable though the ants may be, they have at least one clear weakness. They rely largely upon chemical cues to communicate with one another and perceive their world. Most of the myrmecophilous arthropods take full advantage of this by secreting various chemicals, effectively hacking into the ants' language and hijacking their behavior. In this chemical language, if you know the proper word to speak, it has all the potency of a magic spell. The ants are transformed from vicious killers to ardent protectors. Many species of Lycaenid caterpillars exude chemicals from pores on their body, giving them a scent that the ants of certain species find highly attractive. Thus perfumed, these otherwise defenseless creatures are tended to carefully by the ants as they graze placidly on whatever plants they happen to be living on. In return for this care, many species produce a sugary solution from a gland on their back. Interestingly enough, there are at least some cases where this artificial nectar contains something valuable alongside the sugar. Lycaenids often feed on legumes, which are nitrogen-fixing plants, and such plants tend to have considerably more amino acids in their tissues. Their seeds are a valuable source of protein in many cultures. The caterpillars that feed on these sorts of plants often secrete amino acids as part of their sugar solution, which is an additional benefit to the ants. While this mutualism is quite agreeable for the ants, there are other species of Lycaenid that are somewhat less helpful. Some caterpillars don't have the nectar gland, and instead merely produce a series of attractive, placating chemicals. This leaves the ants in a tranquil haze, quite unwilling to attack what would otherwise be easy prey. A few species go further than this, not content to merely feed on the plants. After all, there are other more nutritious foods available nearby. Thus, some of the caterpillars will start dining on the aphids that the ants tend to, and otherwise defend. It is as though a wolf found its way into a cattle farm, and fended off the ranchers with a cloud of narcotic smoke as it enjoyed the meal of extra fresh steak. While this is bold enough, there are still other Lycaenid species that go so far as to get themselves invited into the ant nests. Some will simply travel there under their own power, following the scent trails the ants leave for their nestmates. Others are actually picked up and carried in by the ants themselves, once more relying upon a suite of chemicals to influence the ants' behavior. These guests are typically brought into the brood chambers where the ant larvae are raised. One could scarcely imagine a more heavily defended inner sanctum, and the caterpillars grow rapidly on a diet of whatever meat scraps the ants bring in for their young. Having a stranger enter your home and steal your children's food is quite the imposition in its own right, but in a few species this goes even further. The caterpillars are not content to subsist upon mere scraps, and instead begin to turn their attention to the ant larvae. One by one, the defenseless grubs are devoured by the ravenous caterpillars, until they pupate, all the while defended and looked after by their unwitting victims. There is at least one type of Lycaenid caterpillar that casts the trickery and masquerading aside. The species is known as Liphyra brassolis. It feeds on weaver ants in Southeast Asia and Australia. These ants construct arboreal nests from leaves woven together by silk. Normally, these ants are extremely effective defenders of their territory. Faced with such ferocious guards, the caterpillars take the rather blunt approach of simply marching into the nests to devour the ant larvae. Naturally, the ants in this case strongly object to the intrusion and fight desperately to keep the horrible creatures away. It is a losing battle, however, as these caterpillars happen to be armored. Their hide is smooth and thickened, toughened to a consistency not unlike vulcanized rubber. Even if an ant is able to get a grip on this armor, it lacks the strength to pierce it. So the caterpillars slowly march into the nest, make their way to where the unfortunate brood are kept, and leisurely begin snacking on them. Eventually they pupate, remaining within their armored hide while most other caterpillars would shed their skin. When the adult butterfly emerges, it has no protective armor, and the ants immediately attack it. This proves futile, though, as the butterfly is coated in a dense covering of fuzzy, slippery scales that easily break away. All the ants get for their trouble is mouthfuls of irritating fuzz, which takes some time to clean off. Thus the butterfly slips out of the nest and flies off to produce the next generation of murderous invaders. This concludes today's little foray into the unknown. For those who are still curious, here are a few things you might try looking into further. If you found this enjoyable, by all means, say so. If you think others might enjoy this, by all means, share. If you're interested in seeing more of this channel, a subscription should prove quite effective. Until next time.